Okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Remote Learning Hacks. Today, we're talking with Washington Sioux Falls environmental science teacher Jeff Johnson about he uses iNaturalist for his remote teaching. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, I just want to show you a quick overview. iNaturalist has the ability to show and share encounters with wildlife and plants, any kind of organism. Each one of these little pins represents an observation made somewhere in the world. Jeff created a short tutorial for his students on YouTube, and we'll take a moment and listen to a little bit of that.
Hello, my name is Mr. Johnson. I'm here to give you some basic information for how to use iNaturalist to investigate biodiversity in your area compared to the world. So to start off with, you'll see that you can search for iNaturalist up in any search bar. And when it pulls up, choose the option Explore, and you'll find this map here. Since we're working out of Sioux Falls, we can go to the location bar and we can type in Sioux Falls right there, and it shows up as the first option. And to orient ourselves to the screen for just a minute, we see that the bounding box is the area that we are searching in. We can expand that box and change it if we need to, but for our purposes right now, that'll be just fine.
So, Jeff, tell us a little bit about why you set this up and how you use iNaturalist with your students.
Sure. So, like you said, I teach environmental science, and I really like to, if possible, get my students outside to experience the environment and learn biodiversity as hands-on as I can. So I do a number of different units where students will do some identification so that they can be more aware of and familiar with biodiversity in their backyard. I want them to go outside and appreciate what's around them a little bit more. And normally I'm able to go out as a class and we're able to identify trees and birds and all sorts of things. Well, unfortunately, obviously we don't have that ability anymore now that we're spending the rest of the year remote learning. So one of the first things that I try to do is send my students on essentially a nature walk in their own neighborhood with the hopes of them categorizing and detailing just different species they see. They might not be able to name them, but I wanted them to describe them and just be more aware of what's around them. I got some feedback that not all families were allowing their students to go outside, and they didn't have the ability to do that for a variety of other reasons as well. But and so I turned to iNaturalist as an opportunity to explore biodiversity in some way in Sioux Falls, and that led me to develop a lesson where they actually compare the biodiversity using iNaturalist in Sioux Falls to 2 other locations. And I think it's a good opportunity for them to explore their backyard a little bit, but then also compare it to other places in the world. So what I did is I had them go to iNaturalist and type in Sioux Falls like you saw in that video. And I asked them a number of questions about that, about the biodiversity in Sioux Falls. As I showed in the video, you can search for Sioux Falls or really anywhere that you're interested in. And they were able to go and find out all sorts of information. They could click on a pin if they wanted to, and the pins have different colors that go with different categories that iNaturalist has made. And you can see those different categories here. What they can do, I had them kind of just explore a little bit, so maybe click on a pin, they can see the actual picture that was taken, and then they can actually click on that picture and learn more about that particular observation. But what I had them do is, to start off very simple, I had them go and look at the number of species. And so I didn't necessarily care that they knew individual species, but I wanted them to kind of come up with groupings that they would make on their own. So they may have chosen to do insects as a big category, or they might have chosen to do moths and butterflies and beetles. And the basic idea is that I wanted them to figure out, how many different categories of species could they make. And so, that level of specificity was really based on their prior knowledge. So if they knew birds already, they might be able to talk about songbirds versus hawks and falcons. But more than likely, a lot of my students just did really general categories, and that's totally fine. They were able to then go through and answer some questions about the location. So, for example, they could go and they could just tell me how many observations were made, how many total species, and then look at the species with most observations. So going back to the iNaturalist, we could see in Sioux Falls, the mallard is the one with the most number of observations. And the idea is just to get them to explore, how many different species there are, which species is in the highest amounts, and just kind of really work through that process of investigation. I then had them look at the types of ecosystems that were along those, I had them look at the different ecosystems, and the way that they did that is to come back to our search, and they can use this layers to add a satellite image on top of it. And then not only are they able to look at the species, but they're able to zoom in and try to infer why that species might be in that location. And I left the assignment pretty broad, but I wanted them to be able to investigate on their own and come to their own conclusions, which again is a fair amount of freedom and flexibility. But that's kind of the nice thing of exploration, is that they're able to ask their own questions and investigate and try and draw their own conclusions. So it might range from, I got some answers, I should come back to this. I had them, to back up just a minute, I had them count the number of different species in the area and put them into a chart, and ultimately put that chart or that graph in the document here. Then, like I said, I had them look at the iNaturalist app and try to see if they could find different kind of trends in the data. So some people drew the conclusion that areas with more trees would have more wildlife, or some noticed that they were more likely to find ducks around water, which some of these things kind of seem like we would just expect them anyway, but it's nice for them to actually physically see that in our iNaturalist app here in the data collected by citizen scientists. Then the second thing I had them do is I had them move over and find somewhere that was wild. So essentially repeat the same process, but with a place that seemed a little bit to them more natural. And I got some interesting answers on that. The third location that I had them do was one that had some connection to Sioux Falls. So it could be, the same climate, or maybe the same latitude, or something that they saw as having some sort of relationship to Sioux Falls in the natural sense. And so once they were done doing all of that, then I had some connecting questions to ask them. What's the highest biodiversity they think they saw? Which location had the highest? Which one do they think is the healthiest biodiversity? And all of these questions, I had them. My hope was to ask them a question that challenged their thinking process, and then using not only data, but then try to have some logic to answer those questions. And I got some interesting answers. The other thing at the very end, I asked them ultimately with this whole experience, I want them to be more connected. And so the last question I asked was about their sense of place. What did they? How did it change, or did it change? And I got some variety of answers on that, ranging from, I didn't realize how many different wild animals and plants were around me, to, after investigating this, that makes me feel very small, just one of many species in the area. But that was a fun thing to see their reactions. Let's see here. I can go to a student example. So what this ended up looking like, this is a student example where they started with Sioux Falls, and they found that there were a lot of observations, and gave 360 different species, the mallard, and then ponds, wooded areas, prairies. Here's their graph that they made. You can see that they decided to split ducks up from birds. They had things like squirrels, deer, non-winged insects, and this had quite a variety. I had people that only had 4 categories, and I encouraged them to try to maybe split it up into smaller groupings, be a little more specific. And then their more wild setting was Mitchell, which I maybe was hoping that they were going to choose some sort of state park or something, but that's kind of what you get when you give them an option to investigate and explore. If they think Mitchell's more wild, go for it. Absolutely. In the future, I might try to be a little more specific to point them to different options, and then they can explore from there and beyond. But this is kind of the first run through. What else would you like me to show, Anne?
Well, I'm thinking now. Are we still getting feedback? Okay, let's try that. So we had talked earlier about how this was very much a work in progress, like every other educator in the United States and really around the world. You were sort of, this was literally like 48 hours at best notice that you had to start and move in this direction.
Yes.
Having put this out there once, you talked more about helping the students understand maybe a little better what you mean by wild. What other kinds of tweaks, or what other kind of different direction would you want to go, assuming that you are going to be having to do this again in a remote online version? And then another, this is just a thought experiment, is would you, or how would you adapt this for next fall or next spring when hopefully we're all back in the classroom?
Well, I was thinking that this is a nice extension of some of the activities that I have been doing in class. So, for example, I said I really like to bring my students outside. And the really nice thing is that we do have locations around the school that we can actually go to see some of this wildlife and plant life. But we've been sort of limited in terms of comparing Sioux Falls and the biodiversity, what we see here, to other locations, not only in our state, but nationally and internationally. So I think this, if and when I use this for, which I think I definitely will, use this activity in the future in the classroom setting, it may be more of a comparison, comparing what we see to what Sioux Falls has reported, and kind of just bring that scope wider and wider so they can see where they fit, basically so they can see context outside of Sioux Falls as well. Some things I might change. the main thing is just kind of going through and kind of cleaning up my expectations and my directions, which is just a minor thing, really. In the immediate, and I can in the immediate future, I would say give more clarity to what I mean by wild. I guess I assumed that wild meant wild. If I had those instructions, I would have immediately gone to, say, Custer State Park, or I would have immediately gone to, Newton Hills, or anywhere that would be more what I would consider a natural setting. But they maybe don't have that background, so maybe give them more of kind of a list, or maybe even I'm not sure if I can find a map or what, of different locations that might be good launching points. So kind of a clarity to that. And one of the things that I was kind of struggling with is trying to decide whether I wanted them to have their third location be national or international. And I kind of left it sort of vague. So I guess think in the future about how I would like that to look. Ultimately, what my goal is. I wrestled between them wanting to compare Sioux Falls and somewhere close to, immediately they may want to go look at some really far kind of exotic location. And I didn't know if that would be useful or not. And so if I can figure out a way to put their observations and experiences in a worldwide context, I think that would be useful. But I just thought that it was maybe too broad. So that's kind of another area that I'd sort of try and tie in, if I can do so in a helpful, useful way.
Yeah, just some very general ideas about that is iNaturalist has a tool called, first of all, Places, where and you're fortunate enough that you have an outdoor learning classroom where you have been able to allow an area to go natural, and you have a pretty good diversity of plants and insects and even little mammals, from what past conversations.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to set that up as a place in iNaturalist, and then start documenting what you're finding in your place, and let that be contextualized with larger scales, I think that would be a really powerful learning idea.
And that actually reminds me of another thing too. I've really wanted to make iNaturalist observations part of my classroom, but I've sort of struggled with the access that students have to that technology. So I always let them know that it's an opportunity that they have to download this app and actually participate and contribute to these observations if they would like to. And some people have taken me up on that, and they've really enjoyed it and had a good experience. But the difficult thing that I found is that I obviously can't require it. Not everybody has a smartphone, and not everybody even has a phone. So in an ideal world, I'd be able to pull that in, on these nature hikes or whatever it might be, go and find 5 new species and upload them to the iNaturalist app if I gave them the correct background, since we don't want people spamming iNaturalist with sloppy observations. So I'd have to give them more context. But again, in an ideal world, I would be able to have them make some of those observations and contribute to the larger iNaturalist website. But that would be a whole different lesson and a whole different.
It really would be. I've listened in on other conversations, and my recommendation is always that you have the students email you, the teacher, the observations. Because you don't want another student. Well, this guy's wild, because what iNaturalist is supposed to have wild and natural observations. I've actually seen, you could tell the high school class went outside, and somebody uploaded their friend as a primate and tagged it as a primate. Technically true, but not helpful to the primate researchers.
No.
So that would be, anybody who's watching this, that would be thinking about how to have your students contribute the observations. That would be my number one thing, is upload it, have it shared in a Google class file, or just email it to the teacher in a shared photo file. And the other thing that some students really struggled with was this idea versus wild versus captive or cultivated. Because outside, everything is natural, but their tendency is to go for the rose bush in the landscaping rather than the dandelion.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, because the rose bush is, more interesting and, understandably, and it's not that they're goofing around, it's just this idea that it was intentionally placed there versus occurring without human agency.
Right.
So some food for thought for anybody who's thinking about having their students add observations. The second tool that iNaturalist has that might help streamline some of your work of wanting your students to go look at other places is projects where you can curate observations based on any number of parameters by setting up filters. And there's a video for that. We'll put it in the notes. But if you might want to give your students some direction and some latitude, but not just let them have the whole world, at least, to start with, it might be good to give them a couple of different projects that they could choose from to look at other data in other locations. And then from there, okay, then now that they've seen these other examples, go wherever you want in the world and what do you come up with? Those were just some of my ideas. And I'm sure other people have ideas too, so. All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your experience using iNaturalist?
I'm the type of person that's just interested and curious about the world in general, and so I personally enjoyed making it to some extent, as kind of nerdy as that sounds. When you make something new, it's not always easy and it doesn't go very quickly, but diving in and just trying to come up with the kind of questions that guide your students toward an interesting investigation is big, and it's fun. It can be. It can be difficult, which is why maybe I wouldn't have dove into it necessarily if I wasn't presented with this remote learning challenge that we've all been given. But ultimately, I'm glad I did that, and it encourages me to explore the iNaturalist, programming more. I really like that you can access it without signing up for anything. So, you don't have to have an account to go and access all of that data, and it's a huge amount of data, just open and free to anybody to go explore and look at. So I think it's a wonderful program, and I'm looking forward to using it more now that I've established at least one lesson on it.
Awesome. That's really encouraging, and we'll just see where this goes. And when you come up with another lesson, let me know, and we'll have another remote learning hack.
I'll do that. Yep.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. And we'll put your email in the notes too, in case somebody wants to reach out, along with copies of your lesson plans, with the understanding that everybody knows that they're drafts. They're there for you to modify and make for your own students and improve. And if you think you've really improved them, reach out to Jeff and share the love back, because this is how we're going to get through helping each other.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thanks for including me in this, Ann. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right.